InFi, episode 14.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today, my guest is Robert Bryce. I'll read his official bio. He's a Texas-based author, journalist, film producer, and podcaster. The host of the Power Hungry podcast, Bryce has been writing about energy, power, innovation, and politics for more than 30 years. His articles have appeared in a myriad of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Forbes, Time, Austin Chronicle, and Sydney Morning Herald. His sixth book, A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, was published in 2020 by Public Affairs. And he has several other accolades that we're going to actually talk about, or at least some of them in the discussion, so I'll defer that for our actual conversation. Quick background, I knew Robert, or have known Robert for many years going back. I used to be the economist for the Institute for Energy Research. And in my previous life, I did a lot of work on like showing the problems of a carbon tax, things like that. And Robert's briefly overlapped with me being there. He was there for a bit and then he went on to do other things. So that's how we know each other. And we just recently reconnected over at the ARC event in the UK. But we talk all about that in the episode. So without further ado, here's my conversation about energy topics involving politics in the energy sector and also implications of some of the West's notions and ideals upon people in the developing world. So very interesting stuff, and he gives some insight into future regulation. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Robert Bryce. Robert, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Glad to be with you, my friend. Thanks for having me on.
Sure thing. So before we get into the substance, you and I bumped into each other over at the ARC event in London. So when I came back from that, some people I talked to were like, oh yeah, how was that? And other people are like, oh, what was that? I didn't know. So for the benefit of people who don't know what that was, can you explain? Because it seemed like a big deal.
Sure. It was the inaugural conference of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which is a new group that was founded by Bjorn Lomborg and Philippa Stroud, who's in the House of Lords in the UK, and Bjorn Lomborg, among others, with the idea that we needed a positive vision for the future. We need more responsible citizens who are engaging in key issues in society. And also, I think it had, clearly it was a conservative crowd with a more unabashed focus on the importance of the family and faith. And it was incredibly refreshing to me. I mean, really, I would even say inspiring. And I don't say that often about conferences in general.
Right. Well, one thing I noticed was at the start of each day, they had like a live orchestra sort of set the tone, which, normally it's just piped in music playing James Brown or something to get everyone pumped up. And then, of course, people were saying like Jordan Peterson's talk at the end was very uplifting too, that they thought. So,
yeah. And I thought a lot about Jordan Peterson because I've watched him, of course, for a long time and his rise and his struggles, his personal struggles. And I was fortunate, I was on his podcast back in June. And, what is it that he's touched? What is it why has he achieved the level of fame and reputation that he has? And I think he's been able to address this hunger, particularly among young men, for someone telling them, "Look, you got to stand up straight. You got to work hard. You have to take control of your own thing. You can't be a victim." But it's also I think he's kind of a secular Christian. He's an expert on the Bible, and his lectures on the Bible are really quite remarkable. But he's also has this kind of attitude that is the ethos that he's pushing is Christian in nature, but he's not thumping the Bible saying, read the Bible or, repent or any of that. So he's just an interesting character on a whole lot of things, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Last thing on that is, so was it through because Lomborg, because you moderated a panel. So
I just moderated a couple, yeah.
So how did you did you just know Lomborg? Was that the in you had?
Well, he recommended me to one of the conference organizers and chatting with one of the organizers, and they commissioned me to write a paper, which I did for them. It's called Powering the Unplugged, which I've excerpted on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. but they published it, and it's an issue that I care a lot about how do you bring more electricity to developing countries? What are the challenges? And so something I wrote about in my last book, it's something I wrote about, or talk about in my documentary Juice. And so I was flattered to be able to revisit that and have that included in the program. So they printed that, and it was one of the printed documents that they were distributing at the conference. And then I moderated 2 panels and did a bunch of podcasts. So it was a very interesting 3 days.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was for folks. They had in the back, like a lot of times at these conferences, podcasters realize, oh, this is prime, and they're like taking people back to their rooms or something, or sitting in the lobby of a hotel where people. And here they had like separate stations set up behind the thing, like little self-contained modules or pods. So it was really great. It was very professional. Okay, well, maybe the first thing we can talk about then is that powering the unplug. So can you just give us the synopsis of that?
Well, sure. So the challenge of providing electricity in developing world is enormous. There are roughly 1 in 10 people in the world today, roughly 800 million people who have no access to electricity at all. There are another 3.7 billion who are living in what would be considered electricity poverty. They live in countries where on average per capita consumption is less than what's used by a kitchen refrigerator in the United States. So less than 1,200 kilowatt hours per capita per year. So why are so many countries, we live in the West and we're incredibly lucky. And, I'm using this light here and this computer and the rest of, we take electricity for granted. But we're the minority. We in what I call the high watt world, we're the minority. It's the people who live in that unplugged world, the 3.7 billion who are, struggling to come into modernity. Well, how do we help, or what are the things that can be done? What are the strategies that can be used to try and bring more people out of the dark and into the light? And so I just run them down. And one of the obvious ones is bilateral and multilateral lending. The U.S. has been part of this group telling the World Bank, you should not lend any money to people for hydrocarbon projects or for, coal-fired power plants. And so this has become kind of the doctrine among the rich countries. Well, that's just wrong. I mean, we industrialize using coal. If these countries want to burn coal, they should be able to do that. In addition, microgrids are important. That is a way that you can use less capital and bring, smaller regions into provide electricity is one way to do it. But also, I think overall, if there's one punchline, it's we should make electrification more important than emissions reduction. And we just have it exactly backward. Emissions reduction should be the first thing. Well, you're arguing for poverty, and I'm absolutely anti-poverty.
Mm-hmm. Now, this might be obvious, but just to make sure the listeners are understanding, the issue is, I imagine these NGOs and the World Bank, where it's like, oh, we're all for electrification, but we want to build solar panels and wind power and blah, blah, blah. And it's just a matter of, well, that's a lot bigger lift, both on the front end and also just per unit cost, given the realities?
Well, sure. And this is one of the things, and I wrote about this on my Substack, that back in June, President Biden appeared at a fundraising dinner for the League of Conservation Voters, which is a big NGO with an average annual budget of more than $100 million a year that is always advocating for Democratic voters to activate on environmental issues. At that fundraiser in Washington, D.C., he bragged about the fact that the U.S. Export-Import Bank was lending $900 million to the country of Angola to help them build a solar project. Now, and then in their press release, XM says, this is going to help Angola meet its emissions reductions target. And I'm looking at this thing, this is a joke. The emissions reduction target, this is one of the desperately poor country. They have enormous amounts of natural gas and, of course, enormous amounts of oil. They're a member of OPEC. They should be building natural gas-fired power plants. That would be a much better use of that money, would provide more reliable and available electricity to far more people, but instead we're having them build solar panels. This is the equivalent. Let them eat solar panels. Where's Marie Antoinette when we need her?
Right. So let's just walk through that example so people can understand the terrain. So for Angola, is it that their own government also is against the development, or they just don't have the internal financing to get a natural gas-fired power plant up and running, and then the richer nations won't give them the capital?
Well, my guess is this more of the latter than the former. I'm no expert on Angola's internal politics, but, I think the country is probably saying, they want to give us money for that solar project. We'll take that, right?
Right. Gotcha.
But when you look at this in a very sober-minded view, well, They should be building gas-fired power plants. They have an enormous amount of natural gas available, and they're an enormous oil producer. So we should be helping them develop the humanist standpoint. And this is the thing that I say over and over again, Bob, is I'm an energy realist. Energy realism is energy humanism, and we need more of both. But we've lost this energy humanism in this headlong I'm saying the people we here, U.S. government and the NGOs, the activist climate NGOs, they're just dead set against helping these countries develop their own hydrocarbon resources. And I just think there's a certain, and I don't use this word very often, there's a certain immorality around it. And I find it disgusting, frankly, on a lot of levels.
Mm-hmm. Is there an element, and I don't know if you want to go down this path, but for the benefit of the listeners, there's economists talk about this thing called Baptist versus bootleggers.
Right.
And it goes back to, I know you know this, Robert, but just for the audience. Sure. And it goes back to a paper where the economist was saying, like, under alcohol prohibition in the United States, there were two big coalitions who were in favor of maintaining that policy. The Baptists, by which he broadly just meant like the moralists, like the preachers, like the people who truly were against alcohol because they thought, it was from the devil, that kind of thing. But also the bootleggers, the people who were making black market alcohol and, selling it that way, the mobsters and whatever, they also had a vested interest once prohibition was up and running to maintaining it, because obviously it helps them, their business. Once it was legalized, it's not that the Chicago gangsters were still selling beer once, or whiskey or whatever, once it got legalized again. So in this context, I'm wondering, there's plenty of big companies right now that have oil and natural gas deposits in Western countries that they're developing. Could some of this be viewed as like, they're just like taking their competition out of the game by restricting the development of those resources in other countries?
Oh, I suppose that could be part of that. I can't say with absolute certainty. And by the way, I've changed my audio settings, so this should sound a little better. But
yeah, it does.
To me, I think this is the effect of the climate NGOs, is not necessarily the energy companies. And it may be the solar companies know they see this as an opportunity, right? So there may be that aspect of it. But I think this kind of lending, and in particular, that Export-Import Bank example, is just a prime example of the, I don't use this word very often either, but just the corruption of our foreign aid, that in the abandonment of humanism in favor of climatism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, also too, generally, like the progressive leftists, they're very big on doing the utmost to help the poorest members of society. And so, like you say, you would think that people who are living on that little amount of electricity per year, those would be the ones that should be getting the benefit of everything and not being expected to, you got to do your part to reduce emissions.
Well, absolutely. And this was one of the issues that we talked about in some of the podcasts I was involved with for ARC in London. And I looked these numbers up just recently, and this is separate and apart from the electricity side of it, but it's related. The World Health Organization estimates something like 3.2 million women and girls, mostly women and girls, die every year from indoor air pollution in developing countries. And why is that? What is it? Because they're burning wood and dung and wheat straw inside their houses so they can heat and cook food. 3.2 million. So just for comparison, about 3 million people globally died from COVID. Every year, we have an equivalent number of people who died from COVID who are dying from preventable air pollution if only those people had access to propane or butane or some other clean cooking fuel. And of that number, 3.2 million, roughly 200,000, 250,000 are children under the age of 5. So there's an ongoing public health crisis in the developing world that could be solved very rapidly with a very relatively small amount of hydrocarbons, of propane and butane in particular. Mm-hmm. But there are problems with that, right? Distribution and getting that energy to those people. But I just thought that comparison and the mortality numbers are really sobering. We shut down the global economy because of COVID, and yet we have a global public health crisis that's ongoing in developing countries because of energy poverty. So I think the electricity story is part of that, but it's only a part of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting there is one could argue, but climate change is an existential threat, and maybe we can come back to that. But where clearly you can't blame what to us seems a silly policy on climate change is what you were talking about what Germany was doing. at this art conference. So can you, where you were just
Well, there's no explaining Germany. I mean, go figure, Rob. It's just like, if I were a better person, maybe a better Christian, I'd feel sorry for them. I don't. They drove themselves into the ditch. Gosh, must be muddy and wet down there in the ditch. But they did. They drove themselves into the ditch. And what did they do? Well, Merkel and other German leaders hitched their wagon to Russian natural gas. And they assumed that it would always be available. And and all of their industry became reliant on that relatively cheap pipeline gas from Russia. And now that's gone away largely. And so they it sent their industry into crisis. And even despite this crisis, despite soaring energy prices, despite the fact that their economy is now in recession, in April, they shut down their remaining nuclear power plants. I mean, it's just like, what are you doing? I mean, how stupid can you possibly be to forego your energy security and shut down your most reliable, low-cost, zero-carbon sources of electricity? And then what have they done since then? They're expanding a lignite mine, which is the most, when it comes to producing electricity, burning lignite is the most carbon-intensive method. Not only did they expand the lignite mine, they took down a wind energy project to do it. And so, I mean, it's just like you couldn't make it up if you wanted to in trying to figure out, okay, well, let's do all these things wrong. And they just have done it all wrong. And so, like I said, if I were a better person, I'd feel sorry for them. I don't feel bad about it. Too bad. So sad. Sucks to be you.
Okay, fair enough. Well, what's interesting on that too, that as you say, that so folks, Robert and I have been writing on energy issues. That's how we know each other for a decade plus at this point. And the thing that always struck me in this debate, Robert, at least I should be referring to the U.S. policy wonks and those people. That's the one I know more particular. Yeah. So maybe my comments don't extend beyond that. But certainly in the U.S. context, there were all these telling us how the world, or at least humanity's very existence is at stake, and that we have to get down to these very aggressive emission reduction, or else we're seriously in jeopardy. And yet they also weren't for nuclear. Right. And it was like, well, I don't believe you. I don't think you actually believe your warnings, because if you did, and some of them, I think, was it James Hansen eventually came around? I think some of the big gun climate alarmists, to use that term, eventually after a while did start saying, okay, at this point we got to do a crash development of nuclear. That's the only way. Right. And so I thought, okay, maybe that guy actually, but he was rare. And then even there, a lot of the leftist environmentalists stopped touting him as much. Sure. Because now it was like, oh, well, he kind of caved out. He's not good on nukes anymore. So, right. I mean, can you speak to that?
Well, sure. I mean, this is the enormous silliness and I think danger, in fact, of what I call the anti-industry industry. This anti-industry industry, the Sierra Club, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Rocky Mountain Institute, League of Conservation Voters. You take the top 20 or 25 of those, I documented it on my Substack. Their annual budgets are in the neighborhood of $4.5 billion a year. This is an enormous industry. And what are their goals? They are to undermine traditional energy. They're to undermine and stridently oppose in many cases, the use of nuclear energy, and Riverkeeper among them. And these are the entities that have been continuing to fight nuclear power plants, including the ones that are existing, and fighting for the closure of Indian Point, for instance, in New York. Natural Resources Defense Council sued and was involved in litigation to try and force the closure of that plant. These groups are a threat to our energy security, and I can't say it any more plainly than that. And that, yes, climate change. They say they're interested in climate change, but they oppose nuclear. Well, that's only one part of it. The other part of it is that these groups are now aiming to close all of our remaining coal plants and half of the existing natural gas plants. That is the stated mission of this group called Beyond Carbon, which just got $500 million from Michael Bloomberg. Sierra Club, NRDC, and RMI are going to be among the chief beneficiaries of this. This is just, not only is it just bad policy, it's stupid policy. It's just deeply dangerous. So I identify these groups as the enemy because I think that is the correct term for them. They are a direct threat to the energy security of the United States.
So having said that, maybe we should just
And I get worked up here, Murphy. I mean, I just I've looked at it for too long. I've seen it for all these years, and it's finally made it clear that no, it's not just that they say they're interested in climate. They are actively trying to undermine our most important energy network. And I find that absolutely wrong. And I'll oppose them with all my energy because what they are proposing would be ruinous at a time when the electric grid is already facing reliability challenges.
Yeah. So why don't we, though, just for, in case some listeners sure, I don't want women and girls dying from indoor air pollution, and I don't want U.S. energy security impaired. But come on, guys, isn't the science pretty clear about we need drastic emissions reductions? I mean, are all these scientists lying, or what? So do you want to just address somebody who's coming at it from that angle?
Well, sure, I'm happy to discuss it. And my response is yes, climate change is a concern. There is no doubt that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. I will grant you all of that. But climate change is a concern. It is not our only concern. We have to balance our action on climate change with all of these other issues in our society, including the danger to our economy if we move too rapidly, the effects on the poor and the middle class if we push these policies too fast. And we're already seeing that, particularly in California, where electricity rates have gone up at rate 3 times that of the rest of the U.S. since Arnold Schwarzenegger began mandating renewables back in 2008. We can see what these policies, where they go. And all we need to do is look at California and Germany for what not to do. And yet these climate NGOs and these climate activists, and I would say even catastrophists, are promoting policies that would be absolutely ruinous to our economy and to the poor and the middle class. And I'm opposed to that.
Yeah, one thing too, I don't know if this was on your radar, Robert, but one of the last things I sort of did when I was still my day job included working on this kind of stuff, is I pointed out that it was the same weekend that William Nordhaus wins the Nobel Prize for his work on the economics of climate change. And the UN put out its document, a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and there was, the New York Times, for example, covered both events in the same story.
Right.
So a normal person could be entirely forgiven for thinking William Nordhaus's Nobel Prize winning work on climate change economics supported the stated goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius limit to warming, when in fact, no, his models showed that was such a draconian overkill goal. It would be better for humanity if the governments of the world did nothing rather than trying to limit total warming to 1.5 C. So just to underscore the chasm between what the published peer-reviewed literature was saying and what was being reported in the media. So to me, that's, people say, are these scientists lying? I say, no. But if you look, it's almost like the telephone game. When you look at the peer-reviewed literature, then to the chapter that it was in the IPCC's, periodic reports, to then the overall summary, and then the summary for policymakers, and then the newspaper headline about that.
Sure.
Each step, it just got more and more alarmist.
But that's the nature of this whole game, right? And remember, no politician ever gets elected by saying everything's going to be fine. The wolf has to be at the door, right? The barbarians have to be at the gate. There is this civilizational, we're going to die if we don't do what I say, right? So this explains a lot of the climate alarmism. And Roger Pilkey Jr. has done great work on this, pointing out that so much of this alarmist rhetoric is based on this scenario known as RCP 8.5, which says that, we're just going to be burning staggering amounts of coal. And in fact, coal demand is still rising slightly, but it's plateaued. The scenario is completely discredited. And yet, won't say the majority, but many of these research papers and academic studies that are done on climate and climate scenarios rely on this outlier, this RCP 8.5 scenario that does not reflect the reality of where we are globally. So you don't get as much attention if you're an academic, if you say, things are, we might just stumble through this and be okay. No, you get headlines, you get press releases, you get interviewed on the television. If you say, the wolf is at the door, we're going to die unless we do something. So this extremist rhetoric is part of the business of climatism and renewable energy fetishism. We have to have these extreme scenarios to justify massive amounts of spending under the Inflation Reduction Act or, overriding local community objections or whatever it is.
Right. And it's not just that the incentives are rigged that, if you're more alarmist, you're going to, certainly get on TV more, get invited to more conferences and get more funding. But going the other way, if you say, actually, I'm running the numbers and I think probably things will be, we got to watch out for certain stuff, but, it's manageable. And that person gets vilified as a denier or like a sellout to big oil, like with Judith Curry, for example. She used to be more of the, quote, consensus, and then started just saying, no, I don't think things are as awful as everyone said. Like she wasn't, like you say, denying that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas. I guess that's something too that people might not realize is in these models, it's not like the obvious, like theoretically lab known results of what the translation is like. If there's more CO2, the more heat gets retained. It's like feedback loops. And like, if it gets hotter, then maybe, more things melt, or maybe this happens, or snow melts. And so now the more sunlight is absorbed rather than reflected back into space. And so it's these second and third order things that, had caused feedback loops. And so it's like, if there's a, positive loop and then a little bit of warming causes more, then that's where catastrophe is projected to happen by the year 2080.
Right.
But that's precisely the thing we're not sure about. So anyway, I'm just saying, like, a lot of this stuff, sometimes people, they're led to believe that, well, no, some guy, in the early 1900s went up on a mountain and figured out that CO2, other things equal, retains heat. And so therefore, if you disagree that we need a carbon tax, you must be a denier. And it's like, no, it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Well, and so, I follow the pro and con arguments. And as I said, my stance is simple. Climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern. We have to balance our action on climate, the mitigation issues, with all of these other needs we have in society. And we have a bunch of them. And in my view, I think it's incontrovertible, regardless of whether you think it's getting hotter, colder, more extreme. If we're facing that prospect of hotter, colder, more extreme weather, more, for longer, then it's foolishness, absolute crazy town foolishness to make our most important energy network, the electric grid, dependent on weather-dependent wind and solar. I mean, that's just nuts. I mean, absolutely crazy. And yet, what are the stated policies of the biggest climate NGOs in America? They're all in, 100% renewables. This is the mantra that they keep repeating. So again, I think that this rhetoric, these policies that they're pushing, electrify everything, all renewables, it's a deeply dangerous, and I do mean that is the right word. It is a threat to America's energy security and therefore our national security. And I take it deadly seriously because the things that are underway now with these natural gas bans will make our society less resilient, and it makes our energy and power systems less affordable and less reliable.
And also, of course, the irony there is that natural gas has a relatively low carbon footprint. In fact, like that's why in the U.S., its emissions, or at least, per unit of GDP, dropped pretty rapidly just when, with the fracking boom and everything and natural gas got so cheap.
Sure. The U.S. has led the world in emissions reductions by far in absolute terms. Now, in percentage terms, you might get bigger reductions in Germany or somewhere else in Europe, but they put themselves in the ditch. The U.S. economy facing big, serious challenges ahead. Let me be clear. But we've reduced our emissions more than any other country in the world, and it's not even close in terms of absolute changes. And the biggest chunk of that reduction is due to natural gas displacing coal in the power sector. So the U.S., and I think it's important to realize too, that now in particular, and in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, U.S. hydrocarbons, and in particular U.S. natural gas, are much more strategic in a geopolitical sense than they were before. 2/3 of the U.S. LNG exports go to Europe. So Europe needs American gas. They need it badly. And so the U.S. Upstream sector, the U.S. oil and gas sector, is a geostrategic asset, and it is being undermined and, in fact, attacked routinely by these NGOs. And I can't say it any more plainly, that these are, in fact, a threat to our national security.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, I appreciate the conference, too. Unless I misread it, it seemed like you were trying to be, not feed into China alarmism, but just to explain the deal there. So can you explain, I know there's a lot of people worried about, are we getting dependent on rare earths from China, things of that nature. Do you want to just speak in general about how
Sure.
does the relationship with China factor into these issues?
Sure. One of the other key issues that as we think about our energy future in the United States is, okay, well, what about the supply chains? And I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, and we talked about nuclear already, but Russia controls about 46 or 47% of the global enriched uranium market. So roughly 25% of the nuclear fuel now used in the U.S. in our nuclear fleet comes from Russia. Well, Russia's not our friend. That has become very obvious. China is not our friend either. And I'm not a China basher, but China has, over a period of decades, built up its internal mining, refining, and processing capacity on nearly all of the metals that are required for alternative energy. I don't call it renewable. I don't call it green. I don't call it clean. It's alternative because it's not green. It's not clean. It's not renewable. So wind turbines and electric vehicles, what do they require? They require neodymium iron boron magnets. These are high coercivity magnets, and they have to be doped with two rare earths, dysprosium and or terbium. China controls 90% of the global magnet market and 100% of the market for dysprosium and terbium. Why, in the name of Peter, Paul, and Mary, would the United States make its auto sector dependent on Chinese supply chains? And yet this is the stated goal of this administration. It's the stated goal of the Environmental Protection Agency, which in April proposed a rule that would require automakers in the U.S. to sell 2/3 of their vehicles by 2032 to be all electric. What are you doing? Why would you make our system dependent on Chinese supply chains? And if you want more proof of this, look at the Department of Commerce report that came out, I think it was in 2021, on these magnets, heavily redacted because of the importance of these magnets to their defense sector. So, the blindness with which we are stumbling into a series of strategic situations in which we are going to be dependent on countries that are not our friends. I mean, it's truly staggering what is happening with very little regard. And you don't read about it in the New York Times. You don't read about it in the Washington Post. And NPR is not going to cover it. Oh, it's just green, clean, la, 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 with no understanding of what the potential ramifications are here.
So, Robert, here, I'm just confessing my ignorance on this. Why is China is it like they just happen to have the natural deposits of something, or just like could that reliance or near monopoly be broken up over time?
Well, so let's take the last one first. Yes, over time, the U.S. could build up its rare earth supplies, and rare earths that's a term of art, and they're not that rare. I mean, they're found in a lot of ore deposits, and so we could be in a stronger position, but we're not doing that. We're not mining them anymore. We're not processing them anymore. So it was in the 1990s when Deng Xiaoping made it very clear. He said, the Mideast has oil, we have rare earth elements, we're going to exploit them. And fully integrated rare earth sector from mining, processing, and fabrication. And so they have made this a strategic choice with very strong government backing over decades to make their industry the dominant industry globally in these critical elements, as well as critical metals and minerals. So graphite, for instance, China announced they're going to restrain exports of graphite, which is key for batteries. They can have dominant positions in refining and processing of copper, molybdenum, lithium, and a dominant position in electric vehicles as well. Now, I don't give a fig about electric vehicles. I think it's a big waste of time and money. But nevertheless, they have made themselves into a dominant player in that sector. And the U.S. we're looking at this, and the Biden administration and others saying, oh, well, we should all be driving electric vehicles. Well, that's easy to say if you have unlimited amounts of money and you have another car and the rest of it. But the supply chain issue is the key one here. Why are we not talking about this? Why do you think Elon Musk is building the next Tesla factory in Shanghai? It's not a coincidence.
Okay. Maybe let's talk about, I know you've got a documentary. Do you want to tell the folks about that?
Sure. Well, I'm a reluctant documentarian, I guess, Dr. Murphy. I made the first documentary, and it came out in 2020. It's called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. And I thought I was done with it, with that business, because there's a lot of friction. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. But then I was blacked out in Austin in February of 2021 and during Winter Storm Uri, and I realized, man, what is going on here? Why is our grid being fragilized? And why is it so vulnerable? Even here in Texas, the energy capital of the world, How is it that the Texas grid has become so fragile? So that set me and my colleague Tyson Culver on another journey. And now our new documentary is called Juice, Power, Politics, and the Grid. We're going to have it out in January 2024. It's a 5-part docuseries in which we explain how our grid got fragilized and why we need fission to fix it.
Well, I know when that happened at the time, I know a lot of people were saying it's because Texas has a free market in electricity, and that's what the problem was. So I'm guessing that's not the full story.
Well, this goes to the heart of the questions about electricity and whether it's a commodity or service. And it also involves the legacy of Enron. And my first book now, I've written 6 books. My first book was on Enron called Pipe Dreams, Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron. And what did Enron propose? What did they want? They wanted the commoditization of electricity, right? They wanted to do away with the old vertically integrated monopoly utilities by claiming, oh, well, they're too inflexible. We're building too much capacity. Let's make it a free market, and we'll let all these independent power producers, including Enron and their own power plants. And by the way, wind energy, which Enron was doing that too. They wanted all of this to be able to come in and compete in the marketplace. Well, the electricity market is not a market, really. I mean, it's fashioned as a market, but electricity, I would argue, is more of a service than it is a commodity. And so, but back to Texas, that's kind of the preamble. Texas spent something like $60 billion on wind and solar in the years before the blackout in Winter Storm Uri. And what happened when the grid was on the verge of collapse? Within a few minutes of total shutdown in Texas, which would put 26 million people in the dark at a time when the wind is blowing sideways and it's snowing like crazy and temperatures are, below freezing. Where did all that wind and solar go? Well, it all went to Cancun with Ted Cruz. Not available. None of it was available. Not generating a single watt during that critical period. And yet, don't blame wind and solar. Don't blame them. Nobody expected them to produce. Oh, okay. So we spent $60 billion on a whole bunch of stuff that we can't count on. Well, why did we do that? Oh, because of the market. Okay, well, who's to blame? Oh, well, the market's to blame. Well, who created the market? Oh, well, the lawyers and the politicians, but ultimately no one's responsible for reliability. So I understand the arguments for markets, and I'm a capitalist, but this is different. And electricity is a different thing than, pork bellies and natural gas. It's just a different thing.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I made the same joke analogy at the time in the aftermath of that, because for folks who aren't in the weeds on this, what we're talking about. So yeah, Texas had this blackout, and so people on the right were trying to say, well, this is dumb. We shouldn't have, built out so much capacity from wind and solar, because now when we needed it, in the winter when it was, not very bright out and everything, look at but then the people on the left who were for that stuff were making defenses and saying, no, look at the official plant. Was it ERCOT? Is that the name of the thing?
Yeah.
The planning board or whatever that does, Texas electricity. If you looked at their blueprints or their contingency plans, they were assuming in a worst case scenario that wind and solar wouldn't, be doing anything.
Right.
And so clearly it's not. So even though wind and solar did do nothing, it's not their fault because no one expected them. And so I made the joke because Ted Cruz's people were saying this because people were criticizing him, folks, as he went to Cancun.
Yeah, right.
And so people, like his official press release was kind of saying, well, I mean, what could he really do? And so people were criticizing him, saying, good to see that Ted Cruz's own people know he's useless. So that I made the joke, Robert, to kind of put them together and to say the defense the left is giving for wind and solar is basically saying, well, nobody expected them to do anything anyway, so why are you blaming them?
Right, yeah. So, but think about this in another way. So I like what you said, but okay, so you've got, let's say, Reggie Jackson, right? Mr. October made his career by hitting home runs in the World Series, right? That's why we remembered Reggie Jackson. Oh, okay, so, we'll fast forward to today, and let's assume LeBron James in the basketball business, right? Or what Ohtani in baseball, right? The Japanese sensation. What if we we're paying them $30-40 million a year, but when it comes to the World Series or the NBA championships, we don't really expect them to perform. We have to count on them in the regular season. When it comes to extra innings, no one, it doesn't really matter. I mean, this is the equivalent, right? But right. It's not, it's the more important because we're talking again about our most critical energy network, the electric grid. And yet it's just like, we'll just excuse that because intermittency an and weather dependency, well, that's okay. There's a deep, I don't know, silliness is not a strong enough word, but there's an enormous disconnect. And I think that disconnect is partly the function of the people's lack of understanding of what electric systems are, what our power systems are. They don't understand energy. They don't understand power. And so they can easily be hoodwinked, and we have been hoodwinked.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about, you mentioned your books. What's your latest book?
The latest, thank you for asking, is A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. The paperback came out in May. The hardback came out in 2020 during the depths of COVID, or the beginning of COVID, I think. So here's a tip. So when this book was first published, the world was locked down for COVID. When we released our film, our documentary, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, then June of that year, there was rioting in the streets. So Murphy, the next time I release anything, batten down the hatches, get canned goods and firearms, because I'm sure there's going to be some cataclysm of some kind that is going to intervene.
Your material is quite revolutionary. At the very least, it looks like what's going on.
Yeah.
Activating your sleeper cells.
That's it. Yeah, right. Exactly.
So as we're just look at the clock here, maybe we got you for 5 more minutes, let's say.
Sure.
Can you tell us, so this podcast series is devoted to the future of finance, and so I'm wondering, can you, putting aside your own issues about what you would hope to see, but just you're being a neutral predictor of positive trends as opposed to normative, can you just give us an idea of how do you see energy landscapes unfolding over the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. Well, how much time do we have? No, I'm kidding. I think that we're seeing now more energy realism, and thank goodness. And some of this is due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some of it is due to the war in Israel now and in Gaza. But I think it is very apparent. And if we're going to talk about money and commodities and assets, I'm bullish on hydrocarbons. I think, oil and gas are here to stay. They are not going away. What would be my investment advice? Don't short ExxonMobil, or don't short it for very long, because you're going to lose. Because oil in particular is what allows the modern economy, right? We cannot, almost everything that moves, everything's in our supermarkets is transported by trucks that are fueled by diesel fuel. Or gasoline, mostly diesel fuel. So these are irreplaceable commodities for the near term. And by that, I mean the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. I don't see any way that they will be replaced. So, it's interesting your podcast is about the future of money, because I've been thinking about this a lot, about where is value? Given the enormous amounts of national debt that we have now, we're going to pay $1 trillion on our debt service this year. We're going to pay more to service our debt than we're going to spend on defense. So what makes sense? And I don't know. I ask people all the time. I'll ask you, what makes sense in today's world? What is investable now? And here's my scenario. Well, I know it's your podcast, but I'll ask you the question. So if I give you $10,000 and I say, I want you to make the most return on this $10,000 in the next 10 years, and you're my fiduciary, and you have a duty now to do the best with that money as you could, what would you put it in? And I've heard everything from Bitcoin to gold to defense stocks to AI to oil and gas. What would you do?
Well, the obvious answer is I would invest in this company, Infineo, right?
Okay.
But if you want me to talk about asset classes, I can answer it this way. So I gave a talk back in May. I don't know, do you know George Gammon, Rebel Capitalist guy?
I've heard of it. I think I've heard the name.
Yeah. So he's got a popular podcast. He often wears a ball cap that says "End the Fed." So his show's name is Rebel Capitalist. So he's advising people who are, expat, that kind of vibe. But in any event, I gave a talk there about AI. So I think AI is going to revolutionize industry. Like at first, maybe just like businesses that rely on telecommunication or, like remote workers, because that's the easiest to like replace with a, mid-level or augment. I actually don't think they're going to replace it. I think it's more like one worker now is going to do 5 times as much using these things.
Yeah.
But so I think that's going to be a big boost. And so then the issue was, well, what do you do? And so I thought, okay, well, on the one hand, you might be worried like, oh, so, our wages might go down, in the sense it's like all these workers are going to flood the labor market, these virtual workers. Okay, but then you say, oh, well, what about, so does that mean capital now becomes more productive? Well, no, because like a lot of this is real skilled stuff. Like they're going to be like expert systems, like surgeons or whatever. So it's not obvious that it's just low skill. And so where I landed was to say, at least in the medium term, I thought real estate. Like whatever the robots and computers do, it's not that there's going to all of a sudden be twice as much land.
Yeah.
And so I thought that, like just in terms of, broad asset classes, that I thought having gone through that consideration, my outlook on real estate was better. And, natural resources more broadly construed. So lining up what you're saying, like, if I owned a bunch of natural gas deposits right now, I would think those would be more valuable than I would have thought 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I tend to agree on the real estate part of it, but I think that, to me, it's a confounding time. And you asked me about what do I see in the future? Well, geez, I mean, I tend to be bullish on oil and gas, but if China goes south, well, then the whole world economy goes south, and that's terrible. That's bad for oil prices, right? But these are irreplaceable commodities. And, one of the many counter indicators, right? Everybody's saying, copper, copper is going to be in short supply. Well, copper hasn't done anything this year in terms of price, barely moved, right? Dr. Copper, because of concerns about the global economy. So it is a very concerning time globally with all of the uncertainty, with all these things that, uncertainty. But what I am certain of is that energy will continue to be, energy is the economy. And the U.S. is still in an incredible, I'm long the U.S. I think the U.S., for all of our faults, all of its faults, we still are in an incredibly powerful position relative to the rest of the world when it comes to geographics, when it comes to geography, demographics, natural resources, rule of law. All these things are really important. And so the U.S. is incredibly well positioned, but I am very worried about our political system and the lack of well-functioning, even a decently functioning government. I mean, we have 330 million people, and the only people we can get to run for president next year are Biden and Trump. Lord, help us.
It is odd. Yeah, and I saw a meme the other day about it was from the movie where there's the like wrestler guy that's running where everyone's stupid. I'm blanking on the name of the movie. Real famous movie, and everybody's real dumb, and the guy goes in the future. And anyway, the president is like this real big muscle guy, and they're saying now The Rock has announced he's running for president, so now we're actually living up to the predictions of this movie.
No, not Wall-E, is it?
No, it's as soon as we stop recording.
You'll remember. Like, no problem.
But yeah, I should also mention, just in case you share this with your listeners, Robert, that you had asked what we do at Infineo is we use. What we're starting to do is we're taking permanent life insurance policies and we're putting them on the blockchain. So that's what we're doing. So for people who aren't, don't know about that or whatever, like I think that is something that in general, putting real world assets on the blockchain is what we're getting into. And like I say, we have an expertise in life insurance. So I think in terms of financial intermediation and things like that, that things moving beyond traditional systems and using different technologies. So not crypto, like not dealing in coins per se, but just that underlying technology of blockchain, taking more traditional assets and putting them on there so they can be more easily traded. I think that's going to be a big thing too going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think the fintech world to me is very interesting, and what the potentials are there. But I also, one of the things that I see as inflationary and that is concerning is the shortage of skilled labor in the U.S. And this is something that I was in Little Rock last week, and I was talking to a guy. In fact, I have his card right here. He's in the construction business. Nabholz is the company. They're a major construction firm. He said, we can't get people. We can't get people who can, guys who can turn a wrench, want to turn a wrench, and will stay on the job. And then, or if we can get them on the job, they can't pass drug tests. So, this shortage of skilled labor, diesel mechanics, electric linemen, these are things that are going to be in short supply for a long time to come because of the end of the baby boomer, era and so on. But still, I'm incredibly bullish on the U.S. So, if I was going to say, where's my money? Most of my investment, Schwab dividend, right? Exchange traded fund that's invested in blue chip stocks in America. That to me, I understand that one. I'm not sure about blockchain, but
okay. By the way, the movie was Idiocracy. I just looked that up.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Okay, so I guess a final thing just related to that. So, because I know you're a cosmopolitan guy. You talk to people from other areas. So even despite the turmoil that we see here, you still think, at least relative to its peers, the U.S. you think is all right in the long run or medium run?
Well, I'm very concerned near term because of the lack of political leadership, the lack of clarity in Washington, and kind of the gridlock in Washington. I think that that's a problem. But I could also say immediately, though, that, I live in Austin, Texas. My trash gets picked up. The post office is working. The library is open. So I think we can, we confuse Washington with America. And Washington is not America, but it's important. But we've lost the ability of our leadership in Washington to work in a constructive manner. I mean, they can barely just keep a budget alive to keep the government from shutting down. So that is very concerning. But overall, I would say still the U.S. relative to the rest of the world is an incredibly good position. And the challenge is for us not to screw it up. I mean, and I mean that. I mean, particularly on the energy side. And, there are these groups that are, I think they're a real threat to our energy security and therefore our national security. And that concerns me enormously. And so I have plenty of work to do.
Yes, indeed. So can you point people if they want to see more of your work?
Sure.
I know you mentioned Substack. Do you want to just tell them where they can find you?
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find on the Google. I'm writing effectively exclusively on Substack now, robertbryce.substack.com. I really like that platform. I can write what I want, when I want, how I want, with graphics and the rest of it. So robertbryce.substack.com.
And Bryce is BRYCE.
That's right, like the canyon. So, but I'm also on Twitter @PowerHungry. I'm on TikTok. Yeah, baby, I'm on TikTok. I'm on Instagram. I'm on YouTube. I'm on LinkedIn. You can't miss me. So, but robertbryce.substack.com is my preference.
Okay, well, great. So, folks, my guest this week has been Robert Bryce. Robert, thank you for your time and your insights.
Thanks a million. Happy to be with you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, the Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.